Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Heikkila. I'm a professor at the Price School of Public Policy, and I'm going to talk to you today about fiscal policy and deficits. This is chapter 2 from my book, China from a U.S. Policy Perspective. That's the U.S. Price School of Public Policy at University of Southern California. So let's get right to it. Now, the struggle with fiscal policy and deficits goes right back to the very founding of the United States. And in particular, its first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, who, while he was in his early 30s, wrote an amazing report on public credit, published in 1790, wherein he said it is essential that the credit of a nation should be well established, for when the credit of a country is in any degree questionable, it never fails to give an extravagant premium in one shape or another upon all the loans it has occasion to make. Nor does the evil end there. The same disadvantage must be sustained upon whatever is to be bought on terms of future payment. From this constant necessity of borrowing and buying dear, it is easy to conceive how immensely the expenses of a nation in a course of time will be augmented by an unsound state of public credit. Now, he was writing that at a time that the United States was a newly formed country, and so it was even more perilous and had just fought a war of independence, and so there was significant debt. So the challenges of addressing that debt and putting the finances into shape was immense, but he really did an amazing job at that. And they've even written a play about him, musical. Now, how have we done subsequently? As this graphic shows, we've not done terribly well. Over the last 3 decades, there was a brief period during the 1990s when the US federal deficits actually were diminishing, and we even for a few brief years had a small surplus. But beginning in 2000, that trend reversed itself rather dramatically. And as you can see, there's been some ups and downs, but the overall trend is very clear and rather disturbing. I'm sure that Alexander Hamilton would not be pleased. And by the time we get to 2020, we can see that the deficit is running in the order of $1 trillion per year. So deficit has to do with the flow. It's the net of expenses over intake, over revenues for the federal government. Move this forward. So this relationship then between deficits and debt. Debt is a stock. It is the sort of cumulative stockpile of past deficits. So every year's deficit adds to the existing debt. And you can see decade by decade how the trend is rather worrisome. So beginning 20 years ago in 2000, we had a total debt for the United States government of $3.4 trillion. And at that time, it was about 1/3 of GDP. 10 years later, the debt was $9 trillion and had increased to 60% of GDP. Now in the year 2020, just over this last 10 years, just about doubled again, close to $18 trillion and 80% of GDP. And the forecast for 2030 looks at $31 trillion, an amount that's equal to an entire year's GDP. So in other words, in the current year, 2020, if we wanted to pay down our existing debt, national debt, entirely, it would require us to use 80% of the total GDP for that year just to do so. That figure now, this current debt is about $51,000 per household in the United States, or $131,000 per capita. So each of us has that share of the debt. So if we want to reduce this deficit, how might we do so? Well, if we want to reduce the deficit, one is to look at the expenditure side. Where are we actually spending? Well, we see the total government expenditures in 2020 are in the order of 4.6 trillion. And you can see well over 3/5 of that total expenditure are mandatory expenditures. That's in the legal sense. It's in the sense that we're already contractually obligated to make those expenditures. Things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, other guaranteed payments by law. So we cannot just go in and say, well, let's not do that. Let's no longer meet our commitments for Social Security or for Medicare or other. So this is already locked in. Certainly in the current term, we might think about how those commitments might change over time in the future. But if we're looking at how to reduce the deficit now, that's not a place to look. So let's look at the remaining non-mandatory, what are called discretionary expenditures. You can see that one part of that, one relatively small slice, is net interest. So there's nothing we can really do about that either. We're already, because we have this cumulative debt, there's an interest on that debt, and we're obligated to pay that. So really, you put that in together with the 61%, essentially what we have now is 70% of total expenditures are non-discretionary. So that leaves about 30% of the overall expenditures as the place where, if we're trying to reduce expenditures, now remember the total deficit right now is about 1 trillion. The total discretionary expenditures we have are about 1.4 trillion. So to try to balance this, given that we cannot touch this 70%, would mean a drastic reduction in this from 1.4 trillion to 1 trillion. And if we look at this, half of this so-called discretionary expenditure is for defense. The other half is for everything else that we think of in terms of federal government expenditures on infrastructure, airports, the really governmental operations that are outside of these transfers. So the scope for reducing deficits is unfortunately rather limited. The last really serious effort, and reasonably bipartisan effort, although it was in the end hampered by partisanship, was this Bowles-Simpson Commission from 10 years ago. It was a national commission to take a look at this very problem. And what they had recommended was that that the way to address the overall deficit was to make some cuts in discretionary spending, reform the tax code so that more revenue is coming in and on a more equitable basis, reduce some of those healthcare costs that are driving a lot of those non-discretionary expenditures. Likewise, for Social Security, makes reforms there, for example, increase the age at which benefits kick in, lower other mandatory programs, and improve the budgetary progress. Unfortunately, that was stalled in Congress and did not go through. And over the last 10 years, we've certainly not gotten any closer. So what does all this have to do with China? We're looking at the US deficit. What is the role of China in all of this? Well, one thing that China does is it actually helps facilitate, in a sort of procedural sense almost, the deficits we do run. Because when the US government runs a $1 trillion deficit, what it actually does is it goes and borrows money. And it borrows this money by essentially selling securities. These treasury securities are in effect a means of borrowing money. A bond, you've heard the expression, my word is my bond. My word is my bond. I am bound. The word bond comes from bound. I am bound because I have promised to pay you. And so what we do is we borrow money. And as we've seen, China, when the US Treasury Department goes out and says, look, we need to borrow some money in order to cover this deficit, China has increasingly been stepping forward to help buy up those bonds, because those bonds are issued on an open market. Anyone can move in and buy bonds. When you buy a bond from the US Treasury, you are essentially lending money to the Treasury, and the Treasury is promising to pay you back. But that promise is itself a commodity, and you can take that promise and sell it to someone else who believes that that promise has some value. So that's one way in which China is involved. So if China weren't stepping up and buying these promises, so in other words, if we're not lending money to the US, but if the US were continuing to run those deficits, we'd have to reach a little bit further to try and borrow money to cover the deficit. And that might have implications, for example, for the interest rate that we would have to pay in order to do that. Now, the flip side, while the US is running these persistent deficits and mounting debt, China is doing just the opposite. It is running surpluses, and one way that the surpluses manifest, rather than, of course, debt, is in holdings of foreign exchange reserves. And most of those reserves are held in US dollars. If you look worldwide about where, if a country is running trade surpluses, for example, and it's got this load of surplus funds that it's accumulated through trade, there are only so many places to hold them. The US dollar, and especially when combined with euros, comprise well over 80% of all those currencies held in reserve. And so, at least thus far, when we look at the global financial system, US dollars are still the backbone of that. Now, this is, in my view, the most important slide, the most important point of all when it comes to the role of deficits and China's role in deficits. Now, in our next chapter, chapter 3, we look at trade in more detail. So if you're wondering why we haven't been talking about trade, we do talk about it here in the context of the deficit, but we go into trade issues in much more detail in the next chapter. But let's take a look at this. You'll see the name Tobin here, this deficit, who's got the deficit? Actually, when I was a PhD student decades and decades ago, so deficit, who's got the deficit? Decades, where have gone the decades? But as a PhD student, I remember sitting in a class on macroeconomics, and we read an article of this title. The author was James Tobin, who is a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And this is the basic point that he made there. I think it's a point that's fairly well understood by economists generally. This is not a controversial proposition that I'm laying before you. It's in fact fairly foundational, and it is very important. So these two identities look at different ways of thinking about the total product, the total economic product of the United States or any country in a given year. And one side is to look at expenditures, look at what are we in the United States receiving expenditures for. One is for consumption-related items. Another is investment. Another is government expenditures. And another is net exports. So X minus M is exports minus imports. So that's looking at one side of the economy, this sort of expenditure, the total expenditure that's taking place. Well, what happens? Every dollar that's spent is received. So we look at the other side. All right, we've seen what these dollars are being spent on. Let's look at where they go when they're received. Well, they can be received and eaten up. We can be involved in that consumption, but we don't consume everything. Some of it we have to set aside for taxes. So we look at income net of taxes. So we can save what wasn't taxed away or which wasn't spent on consumption. Now, consumption equals consumption on both sides. So we can put those aside. And since every dollar spent was the dollar earned, we know that these two quantities are in fact equivalent. And this is true, this is the most important point of all. This equivalence is true by definition. It's not, well, it happens to be true and someone can't say, it's not debatable. This is like if I had three pieces, if I eat part of a pizza, you and I are both looking at the pizza, we take some of the pizza. We say, well, what we took plus what remains is equal to the total. That's a kind of an identity, right? And it's true regardless of how much we took, right? If we took less, then more remains, but the whole is still the whole. So really what we're doing here is just saying, well, here's the whole economy, and every dollar spent is a dollar earned. If we looked at how it was spent, here's the way it could be spent. If we look at what we do with it once it's earned, here are the ways we can allocate that. Those two equivalences are always true. Any year for any country at any time, this identity holds. So that's very important to understand because it means we can't escape it. So what does this identity tell us? Well, again, we look at this identity. These two things are equal. The C is equal to the C. So what we get is that I minus S plus G minus T is always equal to M minus X. Now, what does that mean? Investment minus savings. So what we set aside in savings provides a basis for investment. Typically, if there's only a private sector economy, if there's no government sector, no public sector, and there's no international trade, if we want to invest in something, then we must refrain from consumption to an equal extent, right? So if all of these guys over here are zero, you can see the savings is the means by which we can invest. No savings, no investment. But if we add a government sector, then we have a little more latitude that just on its own, we look for it to uh, sort of balance out. But because if we have those two sectors, if there's a deficit on one side, for example, on the private sector, then in the public sector, there may be a compensating surplus or deficit. And likewise, when we add the international perspective through trade, there may be trade surplus or trade deficit. But what we can see mathematically, and something that's identically true, is that this, now let's take a look at this trade surplus or deficit. So M is imports and X is exports. So if we're importing a lot and exporting a little, this is positive. So this is a trade deficit. And it says that that trade deficit will be equivalent to these two deficits, this public deficit, the sum of these two deficits. So this deficit is public sector, government expenditures minus taxes. As we've seen, that runs in the order of $1 trillion per year now. And likewise, we have here the private sector deficit, that investment money that we're spending on investment in excess of what we've saved. So let's put the private sector aside for a moment and focus here, and let's assume that the private sector is more or less in balance. Now, it's not quite, but the really big driver, if we want to look at understanding trade imbalances, has to do with this public sector. Here we've got, as we know, we've got, and as we've seen from those graphs, we've got these enormous deficits here. And that necessarily, given some rough balance in the private sector trade, corresponds to a huge deficit in trade. So one way of thinking about this that's put in kind of very stark terms, and but not overly simplistic, which is if we're eating more than we produce, there's going to be a deficit, and we simply can't escape that. So how does that look from the perspective then of a kind of global perspective? And if we think about China, well, we've got, as I've said before, this relationship holds for any country at any time. And we've seen what's happening in the US. We've got these huge government deficits that are driving these trade deficits. What's happening in China? In China, there's an enormous savings glut. In China, there's a great deficit of saving, and those savings in turn, China is in effect acting as a financial intermediary, as it says here, soaking up domestic savings and channeling those funds to state-owned enterprises and or purchase of treasury bills. So there's a kind of strange symbiosis between the United States and China in terms of deficits. And I use this simple example of a shopkeeper's dilemma. So here we are, we're and wait here, this is us, this is the United States. This is China, the shopkeeper. And we go in and we look to buy goods from China, and we say, well, we don't actually have the money to pay for these. So what we'd like to do is borrow from you. So the shopkeeper says, well, United States is a wonderful customer. It's a huge customer, and it really can help fuel our economy. So yes, we will accept some of these IOUs. And in turn, we will ship goods. Now, in some ways, might seem like a good deal for both parties. We're writing IOUs and we're getting goods back in return. And China also, in some ways, I think because these IOUs do have some value. Right? There's a market out there for treasury bonds, and they are receiving these. So, but at some point, we can well imagine if all that's happening is that we're sending over IOUs and they're sending over goods, at some point, the value of our credit, and this goes back to the Hamilton quote, begins to undermine the value of our currencies and of our bonds and our deficits. And at some point, there's a danger of this arrangement crumbling. At some point, China might begin to think, you know, rather than shipping goods over to the United States and sitting here with a load of IOUs, what we might do instead is think about increasing consumption at home, reducing savings, and directing some of these goods instead to our own folks. And so that in turn could jeopardize the arrangement that we're in. So at some point, a reckoning must come. And we're better off by following the advice of the commission from 10 years ago that looked at ways in order to bring our own finances in order. Because what all of this means is that in order, if we're really looking at trying to reduce this trade deficit, we need to start here and start taking our government deficits seriously, and looking at this Bowles-Simpson Commission. Those recommendations are as true now, in a sense, even more so, and more urgently so now than they were 10 years ago. So thank you for that, for your attention, and we shall see you next week when we look at China from a US trade perspective. Bye-bye.